Okay. The next question, we are going to start with Jeremy. This is a long one, so if anybody needs me to repeat it, I will. How do you plan to approach decision-making that is both effective and equitable on behalf of a district where there's traditionally significant conflicting opinion on what's the best choice? For example, if there was a legitimate reason that Forest Hills had to make budget cuts, what would you consider cutting and why?
Okay, I think I've got it. Thank you. To handle effective and equitable decision-making, the first step is to look at the stakeholders and try to find where they are coming from and where we need to meet them at. This can take the form of interviews, it can take the form of just conversations, it can take the form of looking at data. Once we know where we stand at the start, then from there we can make a plan. And then once we make a plan, we can start to try to execute that plan. In the example that you gave, could you remind me of the example?
The example was, if there was a legitimate reason that Forest Hills had to make a budget cut or budget cuts, what would you consider cutting and why?
Perfect. So this is a great example for this question, because to make those cuts, the first thing you need to do is you need to address those stakeholders and find out what's the most important to everyone involved. Once you know that, and once you have talked to the community, then from there you can start to look at where could we possibly make those cuts and have the least effect on the students possible. Ideally, if we make any cuts, we would like to leave anything that touches students or staff out of it, especially students and staff that kind of sit low on that equity poll. That said, that may not always be possible, so again, that community involvement is paramount, because when people feel that they've had a voice at the table, they're more willing to work with you and more willing to try to adjust to your decisions. Thank you.
Erin?
When you look for approaches that are equitable, one of the best ways to do that is to look for data, and specifically disaggregated data, and data that can be analyzed without bias. So when it comes to something like a budget shortfall, I have seen this again and again with some of the nonprofits that I counsel. And two of the things that I would say are most important there are information and communication. Because if you don't have information, then people are going on what they think are obvious candidates for a budget cut. But the problem there is that what's obvious to one person is not often the same obvious candidate to another person. And so you'll have one person saying like, gosh, I guess our XYZ program is really pricey, so that should be what goes, because that will make a big difference. Or somebody else will say, well, we're using last in, first out, right? The most recent program is the one that'll get cut first. So without an actual systematic approach to how you look at a budget shortfall, that's when you end up with inequitable outcomes, because you've got people going on intuition or anecdote instead of a real system for management. And the last part of that is communicating. Back to the points that you've asked us about, how do we communicate with the community? You really need to have input, but to know that the passions of one group should not dictate what's best for the entire district.
Thank you. Forrest?
So, in my 12 years on the board, we had a mixed board all 12 years. And to be fair, I didn't know that until the last 2 years, because it wasn't really a thing. And we've been through this. We've been through, in 2009, 2010, these were dark times in the district, in the country and the world, really. I mean, it was, so we had failed a levy. That's one of the things that got me interested in actually serving on the board, was I was very involved in the levy that failed in 2009, and we saw that this was going to be a big issue. And what we were able to do, and during the good times, and I will thank the people that passed the levy last time, is that our next 4 years look pretty good. Budget cuts, I mean, we're going to be looking for fiscal ability or ways of stretching this out like the Forest Hills always has. But we're not the dark times that we were in 2010, and then when we failed one about 10 years later. So but you bring through, and absolutely, you take a look to see, or you try and minimize the impact of the classroom. And it's nice having varied viewpoints on how that looks. And in the end, administration, some of the things that we think about are bigger things, and some aids and things like that. We were able to cut, and with the teacher support, we're able to condensed things down where we very much minimize. We still got our excellent with distinction even in those darkest times. So it can happen.
Thank you. Mark?
First of all, at the end of the day, you need complete transparency in any decision that you're making as a board. You need to make sure all board members have the exact same factual data. You need to make sure the community has that factual data. It's one of the reasons why I'm pushing very hard to get on our district website the financial data for the last 5 years and projected for the next 5 years, so that everybody has the same data, so that if we're having disagreements, it's about where we should go, not about where we currently are. So when we have a decision like that, whether it be a budget shortfall or any other shortfall, first thing you have to do is make sure we all understand the problem, we all come to agreement on what the actual problem is. Secondly, from there, what you have to do is you have to identify what your alternatives are. Without knowing all the possible alternatives, you may miss the best one. Once you've identified all those alternatives, then it's literally a matter of going around the room, talking to the community, talking to the administration, talking to the teachers, and figuring out, all right, what is the best possible outcome? It doesn't mean it's an outcome that's not going to hurt somebody, and whether I could be talking a budget decision or just another policy decision. You're trying to pick the option out there that minimizes the impact on the most people. You are simply trying to pick the best option. The only way you can do that, transparency, identification of the problem, and know all of your possible solutions before you pick the best one.
Thank you. And Jeff?
I think the first thing I would say is that we need to keep in mind that if you start asking this question when you're faced with that budget shortfall or faced with the need to make that cut, it's far too late. You need to know well in advance if things turn south, as they might, where do our priorities lie? Where can we cut? What can we trim? I think the second thing to keep in mind, there's some beeping over there, sorry. The second thing to keep in mind is that our first priority to the district is to our students. We need to keep that in mind. We have obligations to the community, we have obligations to taxpayers, but our first obligation as board members would be to the students. The third principle I'd keep in mind here is that you should look at configurations before you should look at cutting things. Sometimes you can rearrange things physically or geographically to save costs, so configurations over cutting. And then the fourth principle to keep in mind is that you emphasize value over cost. Dollars have to be spent, but it's not as simple as finding dollars to cut, it's finding the value that you need to preserve.
Thank you.